In the grand ballroom of Chicago's most exclusive wedding venue, Maria Delgado scrubs glasses that cost more than her weekly wage. No one sees her, just another invisible immigrant in a uniform. Until the moment the wealthy groom, James Whittington III, locks eyes with the patch on her dress and falls to his knees in shock. What could make a man abandon his perfect bride at the altar? What power does a simple piece of floral fabric hold? As security guards rush to remove the embarrassing cleaning woman, a decades-old secret begins to unravel, one that will expose how far the rich and powerful will go to take what they want, even if it's someone else's child. Follow the journey of a mother who never stopped searching, and a son who never knew he was lost. Their reunion will shake Chicago's elite to its core and prove that some bonds cannot be broken, not by money, not by power, not even by 27 years of separation. If you're watching this right now, make sure to follow our channel for more incredible true stories that will touch your heart and change how you see the world. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. We read every single one. The grand ballroom of the Westshire Manor glowed with ethereal elegance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, casting diamonds of light across immaculately set tables that resembled small altars to wealth and privilege. Every detail was meticulously arranged for tomorrow's wedding, the event of the season in Highland Park, Illinois. In the corner of the industrial kitchen, Maria Delgado kept her head down, her trembling hands betraying the composure she fought to maintain. At 42, her face held the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms without seeking shelter. Her cleaning uniform, faded blue with the catering company's logo partially worn off, hung loosely on her thin frame, crumpled from 14 hours of continuous work. She polished crystal champagne flutes with practiced precision, glasses she would never be permitted to touch outside of cleaning them. Each one cost more than her weekly wage. As she worked, Maria could hear the wedding rehearsal in progress beyond the kitchen's swinging doors, laughter bubbling like the expensive champagne being poured, violin music floating through the air, and the distinct sound of people who had never known what it meant to be invisible. "More careful with those," barked Henderson, the event coordinator, his tailored suit as sharp as his tone. He didn't wait for her response before turning back to his clipboard. Maria nodded silently, swallowing the knot in her throat. Through the small round window in the kitchen door, she caught glimpses of the rehearsal, a carousel of designer dresses, custom tuxedos, and gleaming jewelry. The bride, Vanessa Montgomery, daughter of a pharmaceutical executive, looked like she had stepped out of a bridal magazine with her cascading blonde hair and couture gown that cost more than Maria's entire life savings. "¿Por qué haces esto a ti misma?" Maria whispered to herself, wondering why she tortured herself taking these extra shifts at high society events when her regular cleaning job at the hospital paid enough to survive. But deep inside, she knew. Every wealthy gathering she worked was a search, a desperate, foolish hope that somehow, somewhere, she might find him. The kitchen door swung open suddenly, and the bride herself stormed in, her perfect features contorted with irritation. "Where's the sample of the welcome cocktail? I specifically asked for it 10 minutes ago," she demanded of no one in particular. Maria inadvertently made eye contact with her. A mistake. "You!" Vanessa snapped, looking at Maria as if she were examining a stain on her pristine vision. "Aren't you supposed to be cleaning something?" Before Maria could respond, Vanessa's gaze dropped to Maria's hands, where a small tear in her latex glove revealed a glimpse of rough, reddened skin. "My God, you're handling the glassware with torn gloves. Do you know how much each of these costs?" Her voice rose, attracting attention from the waitstaff. "Henderson, why is this woman touching anything with those disgusting hands?" The room fell silent. Maria felt heat rush to her face as all eyes turned to her. Henderson hurried over, his professional smile strained. "Ms. Montgomery, I do apologize. Maria, please go to the supply closet and change your gloves immediately." Maria nodded, Keeping her eyes down as she retreated from the kitchen, the bride's disgusted expression seared into her memory. In the small supply closet, Maria leaned against the wall, allowing herself one moment of weakness as tears threatened. She quickly wiped them away. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she needed this job. The next morning, Maria arrived at 5 a.m. to prepare the venue before the guests. The early summer dawn cast a golden glow through the windows as she moved silently through the ballroom, adjusting linens and polishing silverware. In her worn backpack was her only decent outfit, a navy blue dress she had sewn herself, mended with a floral patch on the side that she couldn't afford to replace. The patch, a faded floral cotton with tiny yellow and blue flowers, was all she had left from another life. "It has soul value," she would tell herself when embarrassed by its obvious mending. When the event coordinator spotted her bag, he frowned. "You're not planning to stay for the ceremony, are you?" "I'm assigned until midnight," Maria replied softly, her accent more pronounced when nervous. He sighed impatiently. "Fine, but change in the basement storage room and enter through the service entrance. No one should see you, understand? The Montgomerys are paying a fortune for perfection today." As the ceremony time approached, Maria had changed into her dress and was discreetly placing fresh hand towels in the guest bathrooms when disaster struck. Amanda Thornfield, the bride's cousin and a bridesmaid, rounded the corner quickly, her champagne glass sloshing. She collided directly with Maria, spilling the golden liquid across both their dresses. "What the hell?" Amanda shrieked, looking down at her pale pink designer gown where a champagne stain was rapidly spreading. "Who let the cleaning lady wander around during the ceremony?" A small crowd gathered immediately. The champagne had barely touched Amanda's dress compared to Maria's, but the bridesmaid was creating a scene, her voice carrying through the adjacent hallway. "She reeks of cleaning products. Get her out of here," Amanda declared loudly, drawing cruel laughter from several guests. The venue's photographer, seeing drama unfold, instinctively raised his camera and captured the moment, Maria's mortified expression preserved in high definition. Maria backed away, desperate to disappear, when suddenly the crowd parted. The groom, James Whittington III, had emerged from a side door, likely seeking a moment of peace before the ceremony. He was handsome in the polished way of the privileged, tall, with carefully styled dark hair and a custom tuxedo that accentuated his athletic build. But when his eyes landed on Maria, something extraordinary happened. The color drained from his face. He wasn't looking at her eyes, or even at the champagne stains spreading across her dress. His gaze had locked onto the floral patch on her side. And then, to everyone's absolute shock, James Whittington III, heir to the Whittington real estate fortune, Princeton graduate and man of the hour, fell to his knees before the cleaning woman. The room froze in collective disbelief. The music from the main hall seemed to fade away. The photographer lowered his camera, too stunned to capture this unexpected moment. Amanda's complaints died in her throat. The bride, who had just entered the hallway in search of her groom, stood paralyzed in the doorway, her perfect makeup unable to hide her horror. James, still on his knees, reached out with a trembling hand toward the floral patch on Maria's dress. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper, cracked with emotion and disbelief. "Where?" He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the faded fabric. "Where did you get that cloth?" The grand ballroom had transformed into a theater of whispers. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances while the wedding planner, Henderson, frantically attempted to pull James to his feet. The groom remained transfixed, as though the patterned fabric on Maria's dress had cast a spell over him. His fingers hovered just inches from the patch, trembling like autumn leaves. Maria stood frozen, clutching the hem of her navy dress like a shield. The cheap polyester fabric between her fingers was suddenly the only thing anchoring her to reality in this surreal moment. Her mind raced. Why would this wealthy man, about to marry into one of Chicago's elite families, be staring at her homemade dress with such raw emotion? The small yellow and blue floral pattern was nothing special, just a remnant from a thrift store find years ago. "Sir, please," Henderson whispered urgently, tugging at James's arm. "The ceremony is about to begin. Your guests." But James didn't move. The polished confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and charity galas had evaporated. His breathing came in short, shallow bursts as he finally found his voice again. "This fabric," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "This was my childhood blanket. I slept with it every night until I was 6 years old. My mother," his voice caught, "my mother sewed it for me." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Vanessa, the bride, pushed through the crowd, her white gown rustling angrily against the hardwood floor. The venom in her eyes could have melted steel as she took in the scene, her fiancé kneeling before a cleaning woman on their wedding day. "James!" she hissed, grabbing his shoulder. "What are you doing? Everyone is waiting." But before Vanessa could say more, James suddenly stood up and bolted away, disappearing down a service corridor. The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Henderson immediately began damage control, ushering guests back toward the main hall with forced smiles and promises that everything is fine, just pre-wedding jitters. Maria remained rooted to the spot, her mind spinning. The bridesmaids clustered together, giggling nervously. "Drama king much?" one whispered loudly. "Rich people and their childhood trauma. Maybe he's having flashbacks to his nanny raising him instead of his parents," another added with a snicker. But amid the chaos, Maria noticed an elderly woman observing her from across the room. Unlike the others, she wasn't laughing or whispering. She was staring directly at Maria with an intensity that felt like recognition. The woman's silver hair was styled in an elegant updo, and despite her advanced age, she carried herself with the straight-backed poise of old money. A pearl necklace gleamed against her lavender dress as she narrowed her eyes, studying the floral patch as if trying to solve a puzzle. Outside in the parking lot, James leaned against his Tesla, punching his mother's number into his phone with shaking fingers. Eleanor Whittington had always been distant, more interested in charity boards than bedtime stories, but she was the only person who could explain this. The phone rang 5 times before she answered. "James, aren't you supposed to be getting married right now?" Her voice carried its usual clipped precision. "Did you lie to me my entire life?" he demanded, his voice barely controlled. "Am I adopted?" The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but to James it stretched like eternity. Then came his adoptive mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by 3 devastating words. "She appeared, didn't she?" James felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The perfect narrative of his life, 4th-generation Whittington, Harvard Business School legacy, summer homes in the Hamptons, shattered like the champagne flute that had spilled on Maria's dress. "Who is she?" he whispered, though something deep inside him already knew the answer. Back inside, Henderson had instructed 2 security guards to escort Maria to a staff room for her own protection. They weren't rough, but their firm grip on her arms made it clear she had no choice. The small room was little more than a closet with a table and 2 folding chairs. The security guards stood outside while Maria sank into one of the chairs, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. Her hands shook as she reached into her worn purse, extracting a plastic wallet insert designed to hold photos. Behind the cloudy plastic was a faded photograph, a sleeping baby wrapped in a blanket made from the exact same floral fabric as the patch on her dress. The photo's edges were soft from years of handling, its colors washed out from tears that had fallen upon it countless times. Maria pressed the photo to her lips, her voice a broken whisper against the image. "Is it you, mi hijo? After all these years, is it really you?" In the main hallway, Eleanor Whittington arrived with the precision timing of a military operation, her face a mask of composed determination. She spotted her son immediately and pulled him into a side room, closing the door with a decisive click that seemed to seal them both away from the chaos outside. "We need to speak privately," she said, her voice betraying no emotion as she reached into her designer handbag. From it, she withdrew a small wooden box with tarnished brass hinges. James had never seen it before. She placed it on a nearby table and opened it slowly, revealing its contents: a torn photograph showing half of an infant's face and an amber pendant on a delicate chain. "You were 6 when your father brought you to us," Eleanor said, her aristocratic features softening slightly. "He told everyone your mother had abandoned you." She paused, meeting her son's eyes directly. "But that was a lie. She was taken from you." Outside the door, the elderly woman in the lavender dress had discovered Maria's navy dress, hastily hidden in a supply closet by a staff member, hoping to defuse the situation. With careful hands, she touched the floral patch, her eyes filling with tears of recognition. "I know this fabric," she whispered to herself. "God help us all. I know exactly where this came from." The world outside the service room where Maria sat seemed distant, as if a heavy curtain had fallen between her reality and the chaos of the interrupted wedding. The security guard stood silently at the door, while Maria's fingers traced the edges of the faded photograph she had extracted from her worn purse. Years of tears and hopeful touches had worn away the glossy finish, leaving the image slightly blurred, a ghostly reminder of what had been stolen from her. The baby in the photograph lay peacefully asleep, tiny fingers curled into fists, wrapped in a blanket with the distinctive yellow and blue floral pattern, the same pattern as the patch on her dress. A pattern she had recreated from memory on dozens of items over the years, desperate to keep some connection to her lost child. The nursery walls in the photo were a soft blue, barely visible at the edges, and a mobile of paper stars hung above the crib, stars she had folded by hand during her pregnancy, whispering wishes into each crease. Maria's weathered hands shook as she held the photograph to her chest, closing her eyes to hold back tears. The security guards had confiscated her phone upon escorting her to this room, so she had no way of contacting anyone. Not that there was anyone to call. Maria lived alone in a small basement apartment in Pilsen, the working-class Chicago neighborhood where many immigrants from Mexico had settled. Her only friend was her elderly landlady, who wouldn't miss her until rent was due next week. "Mi niño," she whispered to the photograph. "Eres tú? Is it really you after all these years?" The possibility that the man in the tuxedo, the wealthy groom from one of Chicago's elite families, could be her son seemed impossible. And yet, she had seen his reaction to the fabric. The recognition in his eyes couldn't be faked. Her heart raced with conflicting emotions: hope, fear, anger, and a desperate, aching love that had never diminished in all these years. Meanwhile, across the venue, Eleanor Whittington arrived with the precision, timing, and cold efficiency that had made her one of Chicago's most formidable socialites. Her silver blonde hair was styled in an immaculate updo, and her custom Chanel suit bore not a single wrinkle despite her hasty departure from her Lake Forest mansion. The wedding guests parted before her like the Red Sea, sensing the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. She found James in a side room, his face ashen, his perfectly tailored tuxedo now rumpled as he paced back and forth. Without a word, she closed the door behind her and extracted a small wooden box from her designer handbag, a box he had never seen before in all his 27 years. "We need to speak privately," Eleanor said, her voice betraying no emotion despite the earthquake threatening her family's carefully constructed facade. She placed the box on a nearby console table and opened it with deliberate slowness. Inside lay 2 objects: a photograph torn precisely in half, showing only part of an infant's face against a backdrop of blue walls and paper stars, and an amber pendant on a delicate silver chain. The pendant caught the light, sending fractured golden reflections across the walls. James stared at the contents, unable to process what he was seeing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Eleanor straightened her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "You were 6 when your father brought you to us," she said, her aristocratic features softening almost imperceptibly. "He told everyone your mother had abandoned you." She paused, meeting her son's eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years. But that was a lie. She was taken from you. And the words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that threatened to collapse the foundation of James's entire existence. Outside the door, voices rose and fell as wedding guests speculated about the drama unfolding. But inside this room, time seemed suspended. "What do you mean, taken?" James finally managed, his fingers hovering over the torn photograph, afraid to touch it as if it might burn him. Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand closed over the amber pendant. "Richard, your father was doing business in Mexico. He met a young woman there." Her voice trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the details. "There were complications when you were born. Your biological mother was very ill. Richard used her condition to take you away. He told the hospital staff she had agreed to give you up." James felt his legs weaken beneath him. He sank into a nearby chair, his mind struggling to process this revelation. "Are you saying I was kidnapped?" "Your father preferred to call it rescuing you from poverty," Eleanor replied, her tone making it clear what she thought of that justification. "By the time I understood the full truth, you were already legally ours. The paperwork was impeccable. Richard made certain of that." As James grappled with these revelations across the venue, an entirely different scene was unfolding. Mrs. Callahan, the elderly woman who had been watching Maria so intently, had discovered the navy dress with its distinctive patch, hastily hidden in a supply closet by a staff member attempting to contain the situation. Her arthritic hands trembled as she touched the floral fabric, recognition flooding her lined face. At 78, Margaret Callahan had seen much in her life, but she never expected the past to resurface at her nephew's wedding. The fabric beneath her fingertips transported her back 27 years to a small charity mission in Mexico City where she had volunteered after her husband's death. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's the same fabric I gave to that poor pregnant girl." Tears welled in her faded blue eyes as memories cascaded through her mind. The young Mexican woman who came to the mission, barely more than a girl herself, creating tiny clothes for her unborn child from fabric scraps donated by American volunteers. Mrs. Callahan had given her the floral pattern material from her own sewing basket. Touched by the young woman's determination to provide beauty for her child despite her desperate circumstances. "Maria," she whispered, the name coming back to her after all these years. Her name was Maria. In the security room, Maria pressed the photograph to her lips one final time before carefully returning it to her purse. Whatever happened next, she needed to protect this precious evidence, this tether to a past that had been violently severed. For 27 years, she had survived solely on the hope of someday finding her son, drifting through life like a ghost, taking whatever work she could find, scanning crowds for a face that would grow increasingly unrecognizable as years passed. She had almost given up hope, almost. But now, as she sat in this small room surrounded by the excess of wealth that had always excluded her, Maria felt something stir within her chest, something that had been dormant for decades. It wasn't just hope, it was certainty. She knew with the unshakable instinct that only a mother could possess that her search had finally ended. The wealthy groom, James Whittington III, with his perfectly tailored tuxedo and privileged life, was her son, her baby. Her heart walking around outside her body all these years, and nothing, not security guards, not powerful families, not decades of separation, would stop her from reclaiming the truth. Mrs. Callahan's weathered hands trembled as she clutched her cell phone, punching in James's number with shaking fingers. Outside the storage closet where she had discovered Maria's navy dress, the wedding venue hummed with confusion and speculation. Waitstaff whispered in corners, while guests gathered in small clusters. champagne glasses forgotten as they exchanged theories about the groom's dramatic disappearance. The phone rang 4 times before James answered, his voice strained and hollow. "Aunt Margaret? I can't talk right now." "James," she interrupted, her voice carrying the urgency of a woman who had carried a secret for too long. "That fabric patch, the one on that cleaning woman's dress, I know where it came from." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, barely audible, "What do you mean?" Mrs. Callahan closed her eyes, memories flooding back like a dam breaking. "It was given by my sister to a young pregnant girl years ago. A girl with no home, no family to help her. She used to sew doll clothes with that fabric, tiny dresses and blankets for the toys at our mission in Mexico City." Her voice cracked with emotion. The girl's name was Maria. In the side room where Eleanor had delivered her devastating revelation, James sank deeper into his chair. The phone pressed against his ear so hard it hurt. Every word from his great-aunt confirmed what he already knew deep in his bones, that the foundation of his life was built on lies. "James, are you still there?" Mrs. Callahan's voice sounded distant and tinny. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm here. There's more you should know. That girl, Maria, she was so young but determined. She made paper stars for her baby's nursery. She talked about how her child would reach for them one day." Mrs. Callahan paused, her breath catching. "When she disappeared from the mission, we were told she had changed her mind about keeping the baby. None of us questioned it. We should have." James ended the call without responding, his mind reeling. The torn photograph in Eleanor's wooden box flashed before his eyes, a nursery with paper stars hanging above a crib, not a coincidence. Evidence of a life stolen. Meanwhile, in the main reception hall, Vanessa Palmer Montgomery stood frozen in the doorway of the bridal suite, her wedding gown a masterpiece of lace and crystals that now seemed as hollow as her engagement. She watched her mother frantically making calls, trying to contain the damage to their family's reputation, while her bridesmaids huddled nearby, their excitement replaced by awkward discomfort. Vanessa's perfectly made-up face betrayed nothing as she slipped away unnoticed, navigating the back corridors of the venue until she reached the bathroom. Once inside, she locked the door and stared at her reflection in the mirror. A beautiful stranger in white. With deliberate slowness, she removed her diamond earrings, placing them carefully on the marble countertop. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, she grabbed her bridal bouquet from its water holder and smashed it against the wall, white rose petals and baby's breath scattering across the floor like snow. "I knew," she whispered to her reflection, mascara beginning to run as tears finally broke through her composure. "I always knew there was something wrong with his story." 2 months ago, Eleanor had told her a curious family rumor over afternoon tea, a story about James's origins that she had framed as idle gossip. Vanessa had listened with growing unease, recognizing the calculated way her future mother-in-law was watching her reaction. It had been a test, Vanessa realized now, a test to see if she would stay with James if he turned out to be merely the son of a Mexican housekeeper rather than a 4th-generation Whittington. Outside in the service corridor, Eleanor Whittington had cornered Maria, who had been released from the security room, only to be intercepted by James's adoptive mother. Eleanor's face was a mask of cold fury as she backed Maria against the wall, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You've already caused enough damage," she hissed. "I'll write you a check, name your price, but you will leave immediately and never contact my son again." Maria, who had spent decades being invisible to women like Eleanor, stood her ground with quiet dignity. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but unwavering. "He was never yours," she said simply, "and I never asked to take him from you. I only wanted to see him happy, even if from a distance." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise at the unexpected response. Before she could reply, the service door swung open and James appeared, having tracked down his adoptive mother through a catering staff member. His face was pale with shock and anger, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. For a moment, no one spoke. James looked from Eleanor to Maria, seeing them clearly side by side for the first time, the woman who had raised him and the woman who had borne him. The stark contrast between Eleanor's designer suit and Maria's homemade dress seemed to embody the chasm between the life he'd been given and the one that had been taken from him. James did not address Eleanor. Instead, disregarding all protocol and propriety, he walked directly to Maria and for the second time that day sank to his knees before her. Not in shock this time, but in deliberate reverence. With voice thick with emotion, he asked the question that had been building within him since the moment he first saw the floral patch on her dress. The question that would forever alter the course of both their lives. "Are you my mother?" The words hung in the air between them, charged with 27 years of separation. Maria looked down at this man, this stranger who had her eyes, her father's jawline, and felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble. In this moment, he wasn't James Whittington III, heir to a real estate fortune. He was simply her son, the baby she had whispered lullabies to in Spanish while he grew beneath her heart. Eleanor watched in horrified silence, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The photographer, who had been searching for the missing groom, stumbled upon the scene and instinctively raised his camera, then slowly lowered it again, recognizing that he was witnessing something too raw, too sacred to capture. In the distance, wedding guests were being told that the ceremony would be temporarily delayed. Vanessa had locked herself in the bridal suite, refusing to speak to anyone. And in this quiet service corridor, mother and son stood on the precipice of a truth that would change everything. Maria sat across from James in a small cafe 6 blocks from the abandoned wedding venue. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden table between them, highlighting the stark differences in their appearances. James had changed from his wedding tuxedo into jeans and a simple button-down shirt, clothes borrowed from the venue manager, while Maria still wore her navy blue dress with its distinctive floral patch. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning chemicals, wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold as she struggled to find the right words to begin. James watched her with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. In her face, he could now see echoes of his own features, the same wide-set eyes, the slight curve at the corner of the mouth when nervous. The genetic blueprint was undeniable, yet they remained strangers separated by 27 years of fabricated history and stolen memories. "I need to know everything," James said softly, breaking the tense silence. "Please." Maria nodded, taking a deep breath. She began her story, her English accented but clear, each word heavy with the weight of suppressed grief. "I was 19 when I met your father in Mexico City," she explained. "Richard Whittington was visiting for business, something with real estate developments. He stayed at the hotel where I cleaned rooms." A shadow crossed her face. "He was charming, handsome. I was young, naive. When he showed interest in me, I felt special." James listened intently, his coffee untouched, his mind struggling to reconcile this story with the man he had called father his entire life, the stern, perpetually disappointed Richard Whittington III, whose approval he had spent a lifetime seeking. "When I discovered I was pregnant, Richard seemed happy at first," Maria continued. "He rented an apartment for me, away from my family. I thought it was because he cared, wanted to take care of us. Now I understand he was isolating me." She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the floral patch on her dress. "I made everything for your nursery myself. The curtains, the blankets, the mobile of paper stars. I had so little, but I wanted your world to be beautiful." Her voice broke as she described the day James was born, a difficult labor complicated by preeclampsia that left her unconscious for 3 days. When she awoke in the hospital, weak and disoriented, a nurse had gently informed her that her baby had died shortly after birth. There had been no body to view, no funeral to attend, Just paperwork signed by Richard during her unconsciousness, authorizing a cremation that never actually occurred. I knew in my heart you weren't dead, Maria said, tears flowing freely now. A mother knows. But I had no proof, no money, no support. I searched for years, taking jobs at hospitals, pretending to be cleaning staff just to look through records. James sat stunned, his own eyes welling with tears. And you found me? Once? Maria nodded, a bittersweet smile crossing her face. You were 7. You had a high fever and Eleanor brought you to Mercy Hospital where I was working. I was assigned to clean your floor. Her voice softened with the memory. You were so pale, your forehead burning with fever but still so beautiful. I pretended to check the trash bins while you slept. Then I sang to you, an old lullaby my grandmother taught me. Your eyes opened briefly and you smiled at me. The revelation hit James like a physical blow. A fragmented memory stirred in his consciousness, a gentle voice singing in Spanish, a sense of profound comfort despite his illness. A memory that had been dismissed as fever-induced delirium when he'd mentioned it to Eleanor. I was fired the next day, Maria continued. The hospital claimed budget cuts, but I knew. Someone had noticed me in your room. After that, finding work became harder. I moved from city to city, following whispers of where the Whittingtons might be, always searching, always a step behind. But how did you end up at my wedding? James asked, still struggling to comprehend the series of coincidences that had led to their reunion. Pure chance, Maria admitted. I clean for that venue sometimes when they need extra staff for big events. When I heard the name Whittington, I had to see. I never intended to disrupt everything. I just wanted to look at you, to know you were happy. As Maria spoke, James felt the foundation of his identity crumbling beneath him. Everything he had believed about himself, his lineage, his privilege, his place in the world, was built on lies. Yet amid this existential earthquake, a strange sense of clarity was emerging. The perpetual feeling of not belonging within the Whittington family, his inexplicable affinity for Spanish language and culture that had baffled his parents, his instinctive distrust of his father's business practices, all of it suddenly made sense. After seeing you at the hospital, Maria said, I became more determined. I worked 3 jobs, saved every penny. Eventually I managed to get my GED and then took night classes at community college. I became a certified nursing assistant, thinking I might find you again in medical records. James looked at her with newfound admiration. You never gave up. How could I? Maria's voice was steady despite her tears. You were my son. Even when I had nothing else, I had that truth. As they sat together in that small cafe, the afternoon sun setting outside the window, James realized that the woman before him had shown more courage and determination in her search for him than he had ever exhibited in his carefully mapped life. The revelation was both humbling and empowering. There's something else you should know, Maria said hesitantly. After I saw you in the hospital with the fever, I started searching more systematically. I discovered that Richard had paid a hospital administrator to falsify records of your birth and my supposed death. The man's name was Dr. Lawrence Fleming. James's head snapped up. Fleming? As in Fleming Memorial Hospital wing? Maria nodded grimly. The same. Your father donated millions to name that wing after him died suddenly the following year. Heart attack, they said. The implication hung in the air between them. James thought of his father's ruthless business reputation, the whispered stories of competitors who mysteriously backed away from deals, of the strange, tense dynamic between his parents. The pieces were forming a disturbing pattern. There's more, Maria continued, reaching into her purse again. 2 years ago, I finally found someone willing to help me, a young lawyer named Sofia Rodriguez. She was looking into similar cases of immigrant mothers who'd lost children under suspicious circumstances. She discovered that your adoption was never legal. Richard simply created a new identity for you. But before she could file any paperwork, Maria's voice faltered. There was an accident. Her car went off Lakeshore Drive into the water. They said she'd been drinking, but Sophia never drank alcohol. Never. James felt a chill run through him. The Whittington family fortune, the social standing he had taken for granted his entire life, how much of it was built on threats, corruption, and possibly even murder. "I understand if this is too much," Maria said softly, mistaking his silence for rejection. "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know the truth." James reached across the table and took her hand in his, the first physical contact between mother and son in 27 years. Her skin was rough from years of hard work, so different from Eleanor's perpetually manicured fingers, yet the touch felt inexplicably familiar, like coming home after a long journey. "It's not too much," he said firmly. "It's just the beginning." Outside the cafe window, a sleek black car pulled slowly to the curb, its tinted windows concealing the occupant who watched the reunion with calculating eyes. The driver spoke quietly into a phone. "Sir, I've found them. What would you like me to do?" Richard Whittington III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, 60 stories above Chicago's financial district. The evening skyline glittered before him, a constellation of lights that had always represented his dominion, a kingdom built through ruthless determination and unyielding control. At 68, his once imposing frame had begun to stoop slightly, but his eyes remained sharp as flint beneath silver brows, and his hands, clasped behind his back, showed no sign of tremor, despite the storm raging within him. "What do you mean? He knows everything." His voice was dangerously quiet as he addressed his head of security, a former military man named Garrett, who stood rigidly near the doorway. "Sir, James was seen leaving the venue with the cleaning woman. They went to a cafe in Pilsen. They've been talking for hours." Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "And Mrs. Whittington, she gave him the box." Richard's jaw tightened visibly, the only external sign of his fury. Eleanor had kept that box, the torn photograph, the amber pendant, as insurance against him, though she'd never explicitly said so. He'd always known his wife feared him, but he had never expected her to betray him, especially not over this decades-old secret. "And the wedding?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Officially postponed. The Palmer Montgomerys are furious. Mr. Montgomery is threatening to pull out of the merger." The merger. Whittington Development's acquisition of Montgomery real estate would have secured his company's dominance in the Chicago market for generations to come. Now it was unraveling, just like the careful narrative he had constructed around his son's origins. "Find Eleanor and bring her here," Richard ordered. "Then locate James and persuade him to come home. We need to handle this as a family." As Garrett departed, Richard poured himself 3 fingers of scotch from a crystal decanter. The liquor burned satisfyingly as he swallowed, steadying his nerves. He had overcome far greater obstacles in his rise to power. This situation, messy as it was, could still be managed. Across town, in the cramped dining room of Mrs. Callahan's Victorian home in Oak Park, an impromptu council of war was taking place. James sat at the antique table beside Maria, while Mrs. Callahan served tea in delicate china cups that contrasted sharply with the gravity of their conversation. The elderly woman's hands shook slightly, causing the cups to rattle against their saucers. "I should have spoken up years ago," Mrs. Callahan said, remorse heavy in her voice. "When Richard first brought you home, I had suspicions. The timing of his trip to Mexico, the sudden appearance of an adopted child, but he was so convincing with his story about your mother dying in childbirth, wanting to honor her last wish." James stared into his tea, still processing the magnitude of the deception that had shaped his life. "Why come forward now, after all these years?" Mrs. Callahan's eyes drifted to Maria. "Because I recognized that fabric instantly. I was volunteering at the mission in Mexico City when I gave it to your mother. She was creating a little world for you out of scraps and hope. The elderly woman's voice broke. I promised myself, if I ever saw that pattern again, I would speak up. I've carried that guilt for too long. Maria reached across the table and squeezed Mrs. Callahan's frail hand. You couldn't have known what Richard had done. But I suspected, Mrs. Callahan insisted. And now, knowing the full truth, she turned to James with renewed determination. We need to expose this, not just for you and Maria, but for the other mothers and children who may have suffered similar fates. James nodded slowly, his expression hardening. You're right. But my father won't go down without a fight. He has connections everywhere, police, judiciary, city officials. We have something more powerful, Maria said quietly. The truth. Just then, James's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at the screen and his face paled. It's from Vanessa. The message was brief but urgent. Your father knows everything. He's looking for you. Be careful. I'm so sorry about all of this. James showed the text to the others, his mind racing. We need to move quickly. If my father is already searching for me, he'll check credit card transactions, cell phone locations. We should go to the press, Mrs. Callahan suggested. Not yet, James countered. We need evidence, documents, testimonies, something concrete that can't be buried or discredited. He turned to Maria. The lawyer who was helping you, Sofia Rodriguez, did she leave any records of her investigation? Maria's eyes widened. Yes, she had a file. She gave me a copy for safekeeping, hidden in my apartment. Her voice dropped. She said if anything happened to her, I should take it to someone named Catherine Way at the Tribune. Then that's our next move, James said decisively. We'll go to your apartment, retrieve the file, and take it to this reporter. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Callahan pressed a set of car keys into James's hand. Take my car. They won't be looking for an old Volvo station wagon. The night had fully descended as they drove through Chicago's streets toward Maria's apartment in Pilsen. Rain began to fall, splattering against the windshield and blurring the city lights into watery smears of color. James drove cautiously, hyper-aware of every vehicle around them, while Maria sat tensely in the passenger seat, directing him through the unfamiliar neighborhood. There, that building, she said, pointing to a weathered brick 3-flat. I'm in the basement apartment. James parked a block away, and they walked quickly through the drizzle, heads down against both the weather and potential recognition. Maria's apartment was accessible through a separate entrance at the side of the building, down a short flight of concrete steps. As they approached, Maria suddenly froze, her hand gripping James's arm. Wait, she whispered. Something's wrong. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar, a thin slice of darkness visible in the gap. Maria's breath caught in her throat. I always lock it. Always. James instinctively stepped in front of her, his body tense. Stay here, he murmured, but Maria shook her head. No, I know where the file is hidden. We go together. Heart pounding, James pushed the door open wider. The apartment beyond was small but meticulously kept, with simple furniture and walls adorned with small embroidered decorations, Maria's handiwork. But now, everything was in disarray. Drawers had been pulled out, the mattress upended, even the embroidery torn from the walls. They've been searching for something, James said grimly, surveying the destruction. Maria moved quickly to the small kitchenette, kneeling before a worn refrigerator. She pulled it away from the wall with surprising strength, revealing a small cavity in the baseboard behind it. Reaching inside, her expression transformed from hope to dismay. It's gone, she whispered, her voice breaking. The file. It's gone. Before James could respond, headlights swept across the windows as a car pulled up outside. Through the rain-streaked glass, they could make out the sleek shape of a black SUV, the same type used by Whittington Development's security team. We need to go. Now. James took Maria's hand, leading her toward the back of the apartment. Is there another way out? Maria nodded, guiding him to a small window near the ceiling in the bathroom. It leads to the backyard, but it's small. You first, James insisted. boosting her up toward the opening. Maria squeezed through with difficulty, her navy dress catching on the frame. Once outside, she reached back to help James, who barely managed to fit his broader shoulders through the narrow space. They emerged into a small concrete yard, slick with rain. A chain-link fence separated it from an alleyway beyond, their potential escape route. As they ran toward it, a beam of light cut through the darkness, and a deep voice called out, "Mr. Whittington, your father wants to speak with you." 6 months had passed since the wedding that never happened. Chicago's harsh winter had melted into a cautiously optimistic spring, bringing with it buds on the trees along Michigan Avenue and a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the transformation in Maria Delgado's life. She stood now in the small storefront of Second Chance Designs, a community-based tailoring shop in the heart of Pilsen, where she worked as the head seamstress. The morning sunlight filtered through the display window, illuminating her latest creation, an elegant evening gown with the distinctive floral patch fabric incorporated into its design, not as a repair but as the centerpiece, an intentional focal point that drew the eye and told a story. Beside the dress stood a simple wooden plaque that read, "Dedicated to the mothers who stitch together beauty from what the world throws away." Maria adjusted the mannequin slightly, her fingers lingering on the yellow and blue floral fabric. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of changes, heartbreak, and unexpected blessings. After their narrow escape from Richard Whittington's security team that rainy night, she and James had gone into hiding, finding temporary shelter with a network of immigrant rights activists James had connected with through his former law school classmate. The truth about Richard Whittington had eventually come to light, not through Sofia Rodriguez's missing file, but through an unexpected source, Eleanor Whittington herself. Perhaps seeking redemption for decades of silent complicity, or perhaps simply tired of living in fear, Eleanor had come forward with documents she had secretly preserved. Birth records, hospital bribes, and copies of transactions that proved Richard's systematic theft of Maria's child. The scandal had rocked Chicago's elite circles, destroying the Whittington reputation overnight. Richard now faced multiple federal charges, including kidnapping, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The Whittington development empire was crumbling under investigations and client departures, its stock price plummeting as more victims came forward. Other mothers, primarily immigrants, whose children had mysteriously died, only to be adopted by wealthy American families. The bell above the shop door chimed, drawing Maria from her reflections. A young Latina woman entered, pushing a stroller with a sleeping toddler inside. "Buenos dias, Señora Delgado," the woman greeted her warmly. "I came to pick up my sister's quinceañera alterations." "Of course, Carmen. I finished them last night." Maria moved behind the counter, retrieving a garment bag containing a shimmering purple gown. "Would you like to check the fit before you take it?" As Maria helped Carmen examine the alterations, her mind drifted to James. Her son, still strange to think of the grown man that way, had changed dramatically since their reunion. He had broken all ties with the Whittington name and fortune, moving into a modest apartment in Logan Square and returning to his original legal training, now representing immigrant families pro bono. He had even begun using his birth name, Javier, among close friends. Yet despite their shared ordeal and growing relationship, James still hadn't called her mother. The word remained suspended between them, an intimacy neither quite knew how to navigate. She understood his hesitation. 30 years of identity couldn't be undone in 6 months, but the absence of that simple word sometimes ached like a phantom limb. After Carmen left with her sister's dress, Maria locked the shop for lunch break and went to the small back office. A framed photograph sat on her desk, James and herself at the opening of the tailoring shop 3 months ago, standing awkwardly side by side, connected yet still finding their way toward true closeness. Next to it stood a small wooden box containing the amber pendant Eleanor had returned to Maria, a family heirloom that had been meant for her child. Maria opened the box, running her finger over the smooth stone. "I waited for you for so many years," she whispered to the empty room. "I can wait a little longer." The afternoon passed quickly with customers and alterations. As closing time approached, Maria was carefully stitching beadwork onto a wedding veil when the shop door opened again. She looked up, ready to inform the visitor they were about to close, but the words died on her lips. Vanessa Palmer Montgomery stood in the doorway, looking both out of place and somehow humbler than when Maria had last seen her. Gone was the imperious bride-to-be. In her place stood a young woman in simple designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in an understated ponytail. "Mrs. Delgado," Vanessa said, her voice carrying a nervousness that hadn't been present before. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. Javier, told me where to find you." Maria slowly set down her sewing and gestured toward a chair. "Please sit. Would you like some tea?" Vanessa nodded gratefully, perching on the edge of the chair as if afraid to take up too much space. As Maria prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea, an uncomfortable silence filled the shop. "I wanted to apologize," Vanessa finally said, accepting the steaming cup, "for how I treated you that day. I was cruel, and there's no excuse for that." Maria studied the younger woman's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "That seems like another lifetime now." "It does," Vanessa agreed, looking down at her tea. "I've done a lot of thinking since then. About privilege, about the kind of person I want to be." She hesitated. "Javier has been helping me understand. We've been seeing each other again, but differently this time, without all the expectations and family pressures." Maria tried to hide her surprise. James hadn't mentioned reconnecting with his former fiancée. "He hasn't told me." Vanessa's cheeks colored slightly. "He wanted to be sure it was real before bringing it up. We're taking things slowly, starting fresh." She placed her cup down carefully. "But that's not why I came. I wanted to give you something." From her purse, Vanessa withdrew a small flash drive. "When everything happened and James disappeared with you, his father was desperate to find you both. He had his security team searching everywhere." She took a deep breath. "My father's company has had close ties to Whittington Development. I overheard conversations I shouldn't have about cleaning up loose ends." Maria tensed, remembering the ransacked apartment, the missing file. "I couldn't stand by anymore," Vanessa continued. "So I started gathering information. Emails, phone records, security logs." She placed the flash drive on the table between them. "Everything the prosecutors will need to ensure Richard never gets away with what he did to you and the others." Maria stared at the small device, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what it represented. "Why would you do this? You could have been in danger." Vanessa's expression softened. "Because when I saw Javier with you at the wedding, the look in his eyes when he recognized that fabric, I realized I'd never seen him that alive, that real before. Everything between us had been so choreographed. 2 families pushing their children together for business advantages." She smiled sadly. "I think I fell in love with him for the first time when I saw him choose truth over comfort, justice over privilege." As Vanessa prepared to leave, she paused at the display window, admiring the evening gown with its floral centerpiece. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "The way you've taken something meant for patching holes and made it the focus instead." "Sometimes," Maria replied, "what covers our wounds becomes our greatest strength." After Vanessa departed, Maria returned to the back office, placing the flash drive in a secure drawer. She would give it to James, to Javier tomorrow at their weekly Sunday dinner. Perhaps this final piece of evidence against Richard would help her son fully shed the weight of the Whittington legacy. As she closed the shop and stepped into the mild spring evening, Maria felt a renewed sense of peace. The past could not be undone, but the future remained unwritten. She had found her son against impossible odds. Everything else was patience and hope. She walked slowly home to her new apartment, a modest but bright 1-bedroom above a bakery, paid for with her earnings from the shop. carrying the amber pendant in her pocket like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The Chicago Convention Center hummed with anticipation as over 1,000 people filled the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the crowd, which was notably diverse, a mix of Chicago's elite in designer attire alongside working-class families in their Sunday best. At the entrance, a simple banner read, "Second Chance Foundation, Building Bridges, Reuniting Families." In the front row, Maria Delgado sat with perfect posture, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple but elegant blue dress that she had designed and sewn herself, incorporating the now famous yellow and blue floral pattern as a delicate trim along the neckline. At 63, her face carried the lines of a difficult life, but her eyes shone with a quiet pride that hadn't been there a year earlier. Behind her sat Mrs. Callahan in a wheelchair, now nearing 80, attended by a nurse. Despite her frailty, she had insisted on being present today. Beside them was Vanessa, who offered Maria an encouraging smile. Their unlikely friendship had blossomed over the past year, another unexpected gift from the chaos that had begun at a wedding that never happened. On stage, a podium stood empty, a spotlight illuminating it in anticipation. The murmur of conversation died down as a young event coordinator stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the founder of the Second Chance Foundation, Mr. James Whittington." The applause was thunderous as James, or Javier, as he now introduced himself in personal settings, walked confidently to the podium. At 28, he had the same commanding presence that had made his adoptive father a force in Chicago business circles, but there was something markedly different about him, a warmth and authenticity that Richard Whittington had never possessed. "Thank you all for coming tonight," James began, his voice clear and strong. "1 year ago today, the Second Chance Foundation was established with a single mission: to help immigrant families torn apart by deception, coercion, or legal manipulation find their way back to each other." The crowd quieted, hanging on his every word. Over the past year, James had become something of a celebrity in Chicago, not for his wealth or social standing, but for his very public rejection of the Whittington name and fortune, and his dedication to righting the wrongs committed by his adoptive father. "In our first year," he continued, "we've helped reunite 37 families. We've provided legal assistance to over 200 immigrants seeking to trace children they were told had died at birth. We've established a DNA database that has already made 43 matches between parents and children who thought they had lost each other forever." Maria watched her son with a mixture of pride and amazement. The transformation in him over the past year had been remarkable. Gone was the polished but somewhat hollow man who had knelt before her at the wedding. In his place stood someone genuine and passionate, someone who had found purpose in helping others navigate the same pain and loss that had shaped his own life. "But tonight is not about statistics," James said, his tone softening. "Tonight is about the human stories behind our work, about the mothers who never gave up searching, about the children who always felt something was missing, about the families finding each other against impossible odds." He gestured toward a screen behind him, which began to display photographs of reunited families, embraces filled with tears and joy, faces transformed by recognition and relief. "These moments of reunion are sacred," James said. "They represent not just the closing of a painful chapter, but the beginning of a new story, one that these families get to write for themselves, on their own terms." The audience was captivated, many wiping away tears as they watched the slideshow. Maria felt her own eyes growing moist, remembering the moment she had first seen recognition dawn in her son's eyes at the wedding. "Our foundation's work is far from done," James continued. "Richard Whittington wasn't the only wealthy American who saw vulnerable immigrant women as opportunities rather than human beings. He wasn't the only one who used money and influence to steal children and fabricate adoptions. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories like ours waiting to be uncovered. A somber mood settled over the crowd. Richard Whittington's trial had been front-page news for months, revealing a network of corruption that extended from hospital administrators to immigration officials. He now faced decades in federal prison, his empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed. "But tonight is also about celebration," James said, his expression brightening. "About honoring those whose courage and persistence made our work possible. I'd like to recognize a few special individuals who have been instrumental in our foundation's success." He began calling names: lawyers, advocates, donors, each person standing briefly to receive applause. Maria smiled politely, applauding each honoree while wondering if her son would acknowledge her contribution. She had designed and produced all the foundation's promotional materials, working countless hours to create the distinctive branding that incorporated the yellow and blue floral pattern that had brought them together. "And finally," James said, his voice taking on a different quality that made Maria look up sharply, "I want to recognize the person without whom none of this would exist. The person whose determination and love kept hope alive for 27 years. The person who never gave up on finding her son, even when every institution and system was designed to keep us apart." Maria felt her heart begin to race as James looked directly at her. Maria Delgado is not just the inspiration behind our foundation. She is the embodiment of the love and resilience that drives our work. Her story, our story, is proof that some bonds cannot be broken, no matter how powerful the forces trying to sever them. The spotlight found Maria in the audience, and she felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her. James extended his hand toward her, inviting her to join him on stage. On shaky legs, she rose and made her way up the steps, James meeting her halfway to offer support. Standing together at the podium, son and mother faced the audience. James placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, a public acknowledgement of their connection that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "For 27 years, James said, his voice thick with emotion, this remarkable woman cleaned houses, hospitals, and wedding venues. She worked multiple jobs, saved every penny, educated herself, all while searching for a child she had been told was dead. She never stopped believing. She never stopped looking." The audience rose in a standing ovation, the applause washing over Maria like a wave. She stood still, overwhelmed by the moment, by the public recognition of her journey after decades of invisibility. As the applause began to subside, James turned to face Maria directly. In his eyes, she saw something shift, a final wall coming down, a last piece falling into place. "Everyone here knows the story of how we found each other," he said, his voice now intimate despite the microphone. "But what they don't know is that I've been struggling all year with one simple word, a word that was stolen from us 27 years ago." Maria felt her breath catch, understanding immediately what he meant. James took both her hands in his. "Today, in front of all these witnesses, I want to say what I should have said the moment I recognized that fabric patch on your dress." He took a deep breath and, in a voice that carried to every corner of the ballroom, said the words Maria had waited most of her life to hear. "Thank you, Mama, for never giving up on me." The room erupted in applause and tears, but Maria heard nothing. The world had narrowed to just the two of them, mother and son, reunited not just in presence but in name. She reached up to touch his face, feeling the same cheek she had kissed when he was just hours old. "Mi hijo," she whispered, "my son." As they embraced on stage, a photographer captured the moment, not for newspapers or publicity, but for the small album Maria kept in her apartment. An image to replace the faded photograph of a sleeping baby that she had carried for 27 years. A new memory to build upon. In the audience, someone began to narrate softly to their companion, unaware that their words would later be used as the closing line for a documentary about Maria and James's story. Some mothers lose their children, others find them again at the altar. Maria's unwavering dedication to finding her son teaches us that true love never abandons hope, no matter how impossible the odds seem. For 27 years, she cleaned the homes of the wealthy, sang lullabies to a child who wasn't there, and kept searching, not for revenge, but for the simple chance to see her son happy, even if from a distance. What would you have done in her place? Would you have had the strength to keep believing when everyone told you to let go? James's courage to reject his privileged identity and embrace his true heritage reminds us that our worth isn't measured by our social status or bank accounts, but by the integrity of our choices. When faced with a devastating truth, he chose honesty over comfort, justice over privilege. His journey asks us all, do we have the courage to rebuild our lives when we discover they've been built on lies? Are we brave enough to call out injustice, even when it implicates those closest to us? This story of a mother and son finding each other against impossible odds isn't just about one family's reunion. It's about the unbreakable power of love to transcend time, distance, and even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Your support helps us continue bringing these extraordinary narratives to light.